Why is there a roller coaster in Les Mis? I'm not joking. There's actually a scene in Victor Hugo's 1862 novel Les Miserables where one of the main characters rides a roller coaster. A roller coaster in Paris in the year 1817. Why did they cut this from the movie? The question of why there's a roller coaster in France during this time period, why Victor Hugo put it in his novel, and why nobody talks about it to the point where I feel like I'm losing my mind has haunted me day and night for years. So today, we're finally going to solve this mystery together. Let's start with a little bit of context on Les Mis. Victor Hugo's smash hit 1862 novel Les Miserables takes place in the years between 1815 and 1833. It explores the horror of poverty, the injustice of the law, the brutality of the criminal justice system, and the necessity of rebellion against unjust power structures. Those are all very important aspects of the novel that we could definitely talk about. But what we're talking about right now is Les Mis takes place nearly a century before the period we associate with roller coasters. So, how did a roller coaster get into this book? And where is it? Who rides it?
I dreamed a dream in time gone by.
So next we'll have to talk about Fantine, the character who rides the roller coaster. Fantine is a working class woman, or a grisette as they were called at the time. She grows up orphaned and destitute. When she's 18, she's seduced by a wealthy middle-aged man named Tholomyès, who takes advantage of her poverty and naivete. We're introduced to Fantine when she and Tholomyès are on a date, a quadruple date. 3 of Tholomyès' wealthy student friends are dating 3 other working-class grisettes. Together, all 4 couples spend a few chapters adventuring through the most romantic spots in 1817 Paris. Their wonderful day ends with a ride on a roller coaster. To quote Les Mis Volume 1, Book 3, Chapter 4, "At about 3 o'clock the 4 couples, frightened at their happiness, were sliding down the Russian mountains, a singular edifice which then occupied the heights of Beaujon and whose undulating line was visible above the trees of the Champs-Élysées." If you're wondering what the Russian mountains are, this is what they are. Roller coasters. They're some of the world's earliest wheeled roller coasters, actually, descended directly from the giant artificial sledding hills of 17th century Russia. So not only did roller coasters exist in 1817 France, not only does Fantine ride one of them in Les Mis, these roller coasters were a phenomenon. They were wildly popular in Paris for a brief handful of years from 1815 to the early 1820s, when they mostly vanished both from France and from cultural memory. These roller coasters were a fad. They were called the folly of the day, the passion du jour. For this very brief span of time, so many neighborhoods had their own versions of the Russian mountains. They were featured in plays and vaudeville acts. They were heavily featured in books and travelogues. They were sold in novelty merchandise and souvenirs. There were songs about the romantic escapades you could get up to in the carts. Tourists flocked to them, locals loved them, newspapers called it mountain mania. One writer, Hezekiah Smith, who rode them all the way back in the 19th century, described them in his travelogue as, quote, "a stunning velocity, outspeeding the wings of the rushing wind." Author Thomas More described them as, quote, "a delightfully dangerous journey." Author and friend of Victor Hugo, Théophile Gautier, wrote, quote, "there was a perfect mania for switchbacks during the early days of the Restoration. They were described as thrilling, fun, flirtatious, romantic, exciting, dangerous, perilous, a threat to life and limb. People sued them. At one point, various entrepreneurs were all trying to outpace each other and create the most exciting roller coaster. This involved a lot of innovation and also a lot of deeply questionable, deeply dangerous engineering. But the reason why the Russian mountains roller coasters exists and how they came to be in France at all is an extremely fascinating piece of history. They're inextricably tied to the political context of their time period, the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, and the subsequent restoration of the monarchy. The end of the Napoleonic Wars was followed by a boom in tourism, which increased the demand for novelty tourist attractions, exploding the mountain's popularity. The invasion of France by Russian troops, an occupation that lasted years after the defeat of Napoleon, helped contribute to the importation of roller coasters, whose designs had their roots in Russian inventions. In fact, if you speak French, you know that the French term for roller coasters, montagne russe, literally translates to Russian mountains. Long story short, the reason for that is very much tied up with all of this history we've been discussing. This is also why it's easy for English readers to miss that there's a roller coaster in Les Mis. Every translator renders montagne russe very literally as Russian mountains, when technically you could just translate it as a roller coaster. The reason why translators don't do this is because it feels super anachronistic, even though, it's not. There was a roller coaster, Fantine wrote it, and you just have to die mad about it because Fantine deserves this one good thing. Instead of singing "I Dreamed a Dream," Fantine could turn to the camera and say, "My life has been such a roller coaster," and it would be completely historically accurate. So, the novel Les Miserables is famous for including tons of digressions into various hyperspecific topics of French history. Some people say these digressions shouldn't exist because they're not relevant to the plot. These people are called bitter haters. I disagree with them. I think Les Mis needs more digressions. I think it needs a digression about the roller coasters. And the funny thing is, I'm not the only one who believes that. All the way back in 1895, Frenchman Edmond Biret wrote a book called L'Année 1817, where he discussed Victor Hugo's portrayal of the year 1817 within Les Mis. He criticized Hugo for leaving out information about the Russian mountains, particularly one popular play about the roller coasters called The Battle of the Mountains. On page 357, he says the Battle of the Mountains was, quote, very characteristic, and it deserved that Victor Hugo not pass over it in silence. So true. It's been over a century, and no one has corrected this egregious mistake. Les Mis needed more roller coaster content. This Biret guy was right. So now we're going to go on a Defunctland, Yesterworld-style deep dive into the story of the Russian mountains. We're going to talk about the earliest origins of the Russian mountains, the fascinating history behind how they came to France, their many connections, the deep political turmoil of the time period, what they felt like to ride, how they were viewed in popular culture, and finally, why they were shut down and fell into obscurity, and then why Victor Hugo chose to include them in Les Miserables. I would tell you to buckle up and strap in, but it's the 19th century, so roller coasters do not have those safety measures yet. So hold on to your hats, because it's time for a roller coaster digression. Part 1. The Russian Ice Slides. Anyone who has studied theme park history knows that the most ancient ancestors of the modern roller coaster were the Russian ice slides. These were giant artificial sledding hills, constructed of wood, which existed as far back as the 17th century. The wood was splashed with water to make it icy, and people slid down on large sleds. Théophile Gautier, a friend of Victor Hugo, wrote a book about his travels to Russia where he describes them like this, quote, the ice mounds of St. Petersburg are composed of a light lodge with a platform reached by a wooden stair. The chute falls in a curve, on which is poured repeatedly water that freezes and forms a slide as polished as a mirror. 3 or 4 people go down together on a sleigh, guided by a man who sits behind, or else one goes down alone upon a small sleigh steered by the hand, by foot, or by the end of a stick. Bolder people fly down on their stomachs, or some other apparently hazardous position, which is not really perilous. Here's what John Glenn King, an Englishman, said about the mountains in a letter back home in the late 18th century. Quote, the Russians are so fond of sledding that at Petersburg, having no hills, they raise artificial mounts on the ice of the river Neva for the purpose of sliding down them, particularly on holidays and festival seasons, when all the people, young and old, rich and poor, partake of the sport, paying a trifle to the persons who constructed the mount each time they descend. King continues by saying that, quote, the Russians are very skillful in this eminently national sport, which they practice from childhood. But how do these ice slides actually feel to ride? Here is John Glenn King's very 18th century English perspective on sledding. The sensation is indeed very odd. I cannot say it was agreeable. The motion is so rapid it takes away one's breath, nor can I give an idea of it except desiring you to fancy you were to fall from the top of a house without hurting yourself, in which case you would probably have some mixture of fear and surprise. So tourists from Europe were taking notice of the peculiar Russian pastime. John Glenn King even noted that Englishmen nicknamed the slides the Flying Mountains. But the problem with importing the ice slides to another country is that, the ice. Russia is famously very cold. There are far more opportunities for sliding on the ice when your winter season is so long. Gautier describes the entire appeal of the ice slides as a northern phenomenon, calling it, quote, the pleasure of extreme rapidity in great cold, a thoroughly northern feeling that the foreigner coming from warmer regions finds it difficult at first to understand. The solution to the ice problem was already emerging in the 18th century. In one fascinating part of his letter, King describes how the Russians loved their wooden hills so much they created an alternate design that could be used in the summer when the ice had melted. What was the summer version like? Well, quote, it runs on casters, that is wheels, and in grooves to keep it in its right direction. There it is, one of the world's first wheeled roller coasters. King notes that the wheeled carts would, quote, descend with wonderful rapidity. He describes the appearance of riding one of these nearby hills as, quote, very disagreeable, as it seems always leaning on one side, and the person feels in danger of falling out of his seat. But to get back on track, unlike the roller coasters, which frequently did not stay on their tracks, how did these thoroughly northern amusements, associated so strongly with sledding in the Russian winter, make their way to Paris in 1817? The interesting thing is that it's actually kind of hard to find information about the French coasters. Even Professor Christine Haynes notes that their exact origin in France is unknown. The difficulty makes me wonder, was something more important than roller coasters happening in France in the years between 1789 and 1815? Part 2, the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. In order to talk about how the Russian mountains came to exist, we need to describe the historical context that created them. The Russian mountains would probably not have existed in France, or would not have existed in the very specific form that they did, if it weren't for the decades of political war and turmoil that was reshaping all of Europe. So here's a roller coaster focused overview of French history. Let's start with the French Revolution. In 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille, marking what we now call the beginning of the French Revolution. Not any of the lesser French revolutions. This was the French Revolution, the famous one, with the guillotines and Robespierre and Marie Antoinette, the one where the rebels eventually executed the king and queen for committing treason. Hashtag Louis XVI had it coming. Now, we don't have all the time in the world to go into all the nuances of the French Revolution. The most important thing is that generally, there was an effort to replace the ancient system of monarchy with the system of a functioning republic, a form of government where people could vote for their leaders. In practice, of course, the revolution was full of very different factions, who each had very different ideas about what this new government should look like, leading to a lot of complicated infighting. And now, we need to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. Finally, in 1804, this guy named Napoleon Bonaparte walks in and is like, hey, it's cool you guys are trying to build a republic and hold elections for people and stuff, but what if I staged a coup and declared myself emperor instead? And that's what he did. In 1804, Napoleon became Emperor of France. In the years between 1804 and 1815, he Bonaparted all over the place. Nations, including Britain, Prussia, and Russia, eventually allied against him in a series of conflicts known as the Napoleonic Wars. Lots of hijinks happened. Over the years, Napoleon made a series of brilliant military decisions and also a series of terrible ones. Eventually, he was defeated and kicked out of France into exile. But then he came back, and for 100 days he attempted to regain control over France. Finally, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's last stand against the other nations of Europe took place in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. And France would meet its destiny in much a similar way. The Allied nations sent Napoleon into exile with more measures in place to ensure he could never return. Their next step was to ensure a king was properly restored to the throne of France. This is why this period of French history is called the Restoration Era, because they restored the king. After years of revolution and Emperor Napoleon, a proper monarchy would finally be controlling the country again. Basically, the nations of Europe were like, okay, France, you've had fun with your revolutions and your Napoleon, but it's time to go back to having a monarchy, like a reasonable nation. We'll pick up where we left off in 1789.
There was a time we killed the king. We tried to change the world too fast. Now we have got another king. He is no better than the last.
This is also where the plot of Les Mis begins. The story starts a few weeks after Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Jean Valjean is freed from prison right after the king is restored to the throne. You could argue that the Battle of Waterloo and the restoration of monarchy is the real inciting incident of the novel, or at least it's the inciting incident for the novel's political setting. To get back to the history, though, the specific king they installed on the throne was Louis XVIII, the brother of the king that the French people killed with a guillotine. Some people in France were very happy about Louis XVIII, but unsurprisingly, a lot of people in France were not happy at all. Many of them wanted Napoleon back, many of them wanted a republic, many of them resented a king who appeared to be imposed on them by foreign nations. And Europe knew this new king might not go over well with the French people, and that's part of why they decided to occupy France. The occupation. After the Battle of Waterloo, Europe sent millions of troops to invade France as a guarantee against revolution, a military force that would prevent the French people from overthrowing the king. This occupation would last 3 years. It was often brutal and often violent, but it also meant there was a lot of cultural exchange between the occupiers and the occupied. And that's why all of this is relevant to the roller coasters. The roller coasters first appeared shortly after this occupation began. According to Professor Christina Haynes, the fashion for the Montagne Russe in France was inextricably linked to the aftermath of the war, particularly the military occupation. This occupation is why there were so many Russians in France in the year 1815. This in turn meant there was also cultural exchange between France and Russia, which, in its turn, influenced the importation of the Russian ice slides to the suburbs of Paris. The fact that these fun amusements were based on inventions of the country that was occupying France was not a coincidence, and it did not go unnoticed by the French people. Peggy Davis writes in her essay that the fixation on the Montagne Russe reflected France's, quote, frenzy for foreign clothing and recreational practices adopted from their occupiers. Now, this did not come without mixed feelings. Some of the French plays and vaudevilles at the time often struggle with the perceived foreignness of the Russian mountains. Haynes writes that this media, quote, reveals intense post-war anxiety about foreign influence on French culture, and, quote, grapples with the very serious questions of what it meant to be French after military loss and occupation. But the Russian mountains were affected by their historical context in a few other ways as well. One large factor was tourism. The end of the Napoleonic Wars also allowed, in many circumstances, for much freer travel between France and other European countries. To quote Haynes again, quote, in the wake of the war, France was invaded not just with Allied troops, but also with foreign merchants and tourists. Many of these visitors were British, who were eager to see the country, and especially its capital, after being cut off from it for nearly 2 decades. This flood of tourism spurred on demands for exotic and exciting amusements. This helped catapult the roller coasters into a wildly popular phenomenon. Finally, we need to talk about one last important element of the political context. France had just emerged, as we've seen, from decades of war and turmoil into an age where their new leaders were promising stability. A return to monarchy and divine right, but also a return to a familiar and stable status quo. According to Peggy Davis again, quote, to alleviate the burdensome memory of wartime misery in the early years of the Restoration, demand was high for light, superficial pleasures. Victor Hugo describes the Paris of 1817 in a very similar way in Les Mis. He describes it as a time when people search for frivolous distractions while surrounded by reminders of the past political turmoil and the seemingly final defeat of the French Revolution. To quote Hugo describing the period in Les Mis, everything was radiant. It was a time of undisputed peace and profound royalist security. It was the epoch when a report to the chief of police to the king on the subject of the suburbs of Paris terminated with these lines. Taking all things into consideration, sire, there is nothing to be feared from these people. They are as heedless and as indolent as cats. Victor Hugo goes on to argue that the police's assessment is not accurate. Even though Parisians were enjoying this flood of frivolous amusements and distractions in the aftermath of the Restoration, and there was a lot of outward appearance of support for the monarchy, the potential for revolution was still simmering underneath the surface. He proclaims that an indolent Parisian cat can quickly become a terrifying revolutionary lion. Whoa. But at the moment, Parisians were cats, taking in a flood of carnivalesque amusements and distractions. And the Russian mountains especially were a smash success. They became a phenomenon, as popular as they were short-lived. To quote Haynes again, within a year of the Second Allied invasion, the Montagnes Russes were a ubiquitous form of amusement in the French capital. To quote Davis again, to describe the new craze that, by the summer of 1817, had engulfed the French capital, the Journal de Paris coined the term mountain mania. And now that we've rolled through all the historical context, we're finally ready to talk about what the Russian mountains were like to ride. Part 3, the Russian mountains. 3a, citing sources. Before I go into a lot of detail about the Russian mountains, I want to give a few thanks to the sources that helped me a lot in this section of the video, which you can find links to in my bibliography. The first is Professor Christine Haynes' essay, The Battle of the Mountains, Repatriating Folly in France in the Aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. The second is Peggy Davis's essay, Montagnes Russes and Calico, Print Culture and Visual Satire in Restoration Paris. The third is Sun Yun Park's essay, Hygienic Promenades, The Montagnes Russes as Medical and Urban Artifacts. All of these articles are available to read for free on JSTOR, and I recommend reading them in their entirety if you have interest in this subject. I'd also like to thank podcaster David Montgomery, whose interview with Christine Haynes on his Restoration-era history podcast, The Siècle, led me to her work. I'd also like to give a thanks to the Paris Museum Archives and to Gallica, which is where I got the authentic illustrations you're going to see in the next section. Without further ado, let's finally dive in to the Russian mountains. So the first question you're probably going to want to know is, how did the Russian mountains even work? The answer actually depends on which of the mountains you're talking about. As I mentioned before, Russian mountains is a catch-all term for any kind of roller coaster. There were a lot of Russian mountains in France during this brief time period, and all of them had different names, most of them being named after various different countries or exotic locations. There was a coaster named the French Mountains at Beaujon, a coaster named the Egyptian Mountains, a coaster named the Swiss Mountains, etc., etc., etc. And all of these had different designs and different levels of complexity. The one thing that's consistent across all of them is that they were not what we would call industrial roller coasters. That is, they weren't powered by engines or anything like that. Instead, they were powered completely by gravity. You started the ride at the top of the hill, and then you relied on momentum and gravity to get you through to the end. The simplest coasters basically looked like one of the old Russian ice slides. Here is an example, the coaster called the Mountains of Belleville. You would climb up the stairs to the top, get in a cart, and then roll right on down. Then you would get off, and the cart would be pulled back up to the top by a chain or rope. The more complex mountains formed a complete circuit, like a modern roller coaster. Haynes notes that, at one point, a patent was filed for a lift hill that utilized horsepower to pull up the carts. This was in the midst of a veritable battle of patents, as a variety of different entrepreneurs rushed to capitalize on the roller coaster mania by inventing new ways to innovate the experience of riding the Russian mountains. So, in summary, there's no way we can paint all the mountains with the same brush. We'll have to talk about a lot of them individually, and a lot of the way they each individually worked. But before we do that, one important thing we have to address is the locations of the roller coasters. You can't just place a ride in the middle of nowhere. In 1817 Paris, the mountains were mostly located in areas called pleasure gardens, which Sun Yat Park refers to as, quote, an early version of the modern-day amusement park. Many of these pleasure gardens were built on the property confiscated from wealthy landowners during the French Revolution. In addition to roller coasters, these gardens offered a wide range of carnival-like, amusement park-like activities. Many accounts describe ice cream, lemonade stands, and small carnival games like ring tossing. Some illustrations even depict other amusement park rides. This 1818 illustration of the Belleville Pleasure Gardens, for example, depicts an early ancestor to the Ferris wheel. On the right side of the illustration, you can see the edge of what appears to be an early version of a swing ride. In this illustration of the Tivoli Pleasure Gardens, you can see what appears to be an early version of the ride type we now call the aerial carousel, where carts move up and down around a spinning central rod. At the time, this ride was called the aerial promenade. In Les Mis, Victor Hugo briefly mentions people spinning around on wooden horses, which is clearly referencing an early version of the carousel. But as I noted before, all the Pleasure Gardens roller coasters were all pretty unique, each named after different countries, and each with their own different ride systems that were made to make them stand out in a competitive market. According to Park, competition between the different nationalities of montañas occupying the cities appeared to be a fitting analogy for the presence of various kinds of foreign troops. According to the Journal du Commerce, the French montañas of the Beaujon Gardens have nothing to fear from their contenders, because French ingenuity had purportedly surpassed foreign design. Park writes that the consensus about the French montaña's superiority, namely over the Russian and Egyptian ones, afforded a new trope with which to celebrate national identity. The Russian mountains and their rivalry was such a phenomenon it became the subject of a few plays, the most famous of which was called The Battle of the Mountains. If you remember me referencing how Edmond Biret dragged Victor Hugo for not mentioning a very famous play about the roller coasters in Les Mis, it was this play. This play was a phenomenon, and it caused a lot of drama, most of which wasn't actually related to the roller coasters, but was instead related to a parody of a type of guy called a calico, but we don't have time to go into that. The basic plot of the Battle of the Mountains is that all the different roller coasters in Paris are competing to be the most popular. It feels like a Saturday Night Live skit in that it's comedy based off like a popular trending fad. In a preface for a 19th century manuscript of this play, it's noted that this play isn't the author's best work, but roller coasters were a fad, so it got popular anyway. Similarly, this old encyclopedia gives scathing reviews of the various plays about roller coasters currently around in 1817, describing them as lazy, poorly written attempts to cash in on a cheap fad that will be forgotten within a month. So now I'm wondering if the Battle of the Mountains is like a Saturday Night Live skit, not just because it gets popular, but because it's topical, but also because, it was never funny ever, like not even when it was topical, In any case, the Battle of the Mountains, that old, dubious quality play, is finally getting a sequel today. We're going to look through a bunch of different roller coasters that were in Paris at the time, and we're going to make a tier list to determine which one was objectively the best. Let's dive in. Part 3C. Ranking the top Russian mountains. The French mountains. So first up, let's talk about the French mountains, also called the aerial promenades, which were located in the Beaujon Pleasure Gardens. This is the specific roller coaster that Fantine rides in Les Miserables. And this is the first and only time I'll say this, but Fantine was actually really lucky. This coaster was the most extravagant of them all. According to Sun Yat Park, it was the largest, the most popular, and the best represented. It was also one of the very few that had a track that made a complete circuit, which was a huge rarity. This fantastic illustration of the French mountains shows the genuinely impressive scale of the ride. To quote Park, prints and engineering drawings indicate a structure of architectural and urban pretensions, including a neoclassical entrance pavilion and a picturesque landscaping in the central space formed by the ramps. At the top of the Russian mountains was a belvedere, or an elevated place where you could admire the view of Paris and the lush gardens from above. Park notes that, quote, the belvedere at the summit was mounted by a beacon to illuminate the setting even at night. You can see that beacon in this illustration. So what was the experience like? Well, first you would climb to the top of the mountains via a set of stairs. There was even like a secret entrance for wealthy, important people, which is the 19th century equivalent of a fast pass lane. If you were too afraid to ride the mountains, you could stand in the top of the belvedere and just enjoy the lovely view. But if you wanted to ride the mountains, you would get into your cart and roll down either the left or right side of the mountain, these massive curved arms. This illustration makes it appear as if the turns are banked to prevent people from rolling off, and that was successful most of the time. One interesting thing you'll notice is that, because the ride makes a full circuit, people are still in the carts when they're being pulled back up the hill. In Frederick Cotterick's 1821 monograph on these French mountains, he refers to a complicated mechanism of ropes that ultimately connect to the carts to some horses on the ground, which end up pulling the carts to the top at the speed of a trot. So the lift hill was powered by horsepower. Outside of the possibly dull, slow ending where you're slowly pulled up the lift hill, the French mountains at Beaujon were definitely a fascinating, beautiful, and exciting experience. This was the e-ticket roller coaster of 19th century France. Haynes notes that the mountains of Beaujon quickly surpassed Tivoli, which had been a popular pleasure garden under the First Empire, as the premier attraction in the capital, despite growing competition from other roller coasters. So Fantine's roller coaster was also located in an optimal spot as well, the Beaujon Pleasure Gardens of Paris. This garden was so beautiful and prosperous that King Louis XVIII himself even came to visit a couple times. And not only was the Beaujon roller coaster popular among locals, it was also popular among tourists throughout Europe. In 1818, author Thomas More published a comedic epistolary novel called The Fudge Family in Paris, written in verse, where he satirized the common experiences of Europeans visiting France in the aftermath of the Restoration. One of the main characters, a young woman named Biddy Fudge, visits the Beaujon garden and rides its iconic roller coaster. Biddy Fudge describes her experience in a detailed letter, written in rhyming verse. Quote, "Last night at the Beaujon, a place where I doubt if its charms I can paint, there are cars that set out from a lighted pavilion high up in the air, and rattle you down, doll, you hardly know where. These vehicles mind me in which you go through this delightfully dangerous journey. Hold to. Some cavalier asks with humility whether you'll venture down with him, you smile, it's a match. In an instant you're seated, and both down together go thundering as if you went pulse to old scratch. Well, it was but last night, as I stood and remarked, on the looks and odd ways of the girls who embarked, the impatience of some for the perilous flight, the forced giggle of others, twixt pleasure and fright. Off we set, and though, faith dear, I hardly knew whether my head or my heels were uppermost then, for 'twas like heaven and earth, Dolly, coming together, yet in spite of the danger, we dared it again." There's also a later verse where Biddy Fudge compares the experience of riding a roller coaster to the experience of falling in love. You know how I mentioned before that being slowly pulled back up the lift hill was probably the most boring part of the experience? Well, Biddy Fudge agrees with me. Quote, "We both rattled off in that dear little carriage, whose journey, Bob says, is so like love and marriage, beginning gay, desperate, dashing downhilly, and ending as dull as a six-inside dilly. Tragic." But these verses are all such powerful, powerful stuff. So here's my pitch. We should add this to the musical. We should set these verses to music, and we should add them to the musical. It's canon. It's book accurate. Fantine deserves it. Let Fantine have this happy little song about riding the Russian mountains. I'm just saying, it works. So if we're being honest, there's really no way the other roller coasters can top the French mountains of the Garden Beaujon. It's iconic, it's legendary, it is the moment, it is S tier. However, we can still have a competition for second place and talk about the rest of the mountains. The Mountains of Belleville. So the Mountains of Belleville were a lot more basic, more similar to the classic Russian ice slides. However, I think simplicity can sometimes be a virtue. To prove this, I'm going to read out the description of riding the Russian mountains from the travelogue of Hezekiah Smith, who visited France in the early 19th century. He didn't ride the Mountains of Belleville specifically, but he definitely rode something very, very similar. So here's how it felt. Quote, "Arrived at the desired eminence, you enter a little shed, where there are several carts waiting ready for immediate service, and a man in waiting to attend your behest. The descent from this point looks not a little perilous to the unpracticed eye, but, being assured there is no actual danger, your friend and yourself enter the car, which is intended to accommodate but two. Securely braced in the seat, with one arm around the other's waist, each anxiously awaits the impulse that hurls the light vehicle down the precipitous descent of 15 to 20 feet, with a momentum that would seem that it might swerve from the perpendicular and involve the rash occupants in immediate destruction. But no, the only result is a stunning velocity, outspeeding the wings of the rushing wind, and you are whirled along, scarce able to draw breath, far along the course, until at last the dead level, and obstacles interposed for the purpose, put a period to your swift career. After a few trials, this exercise loses its aspect of terror and communicates only an agreeable excitement. So it's clear that these simple coasters could be quite thrilling, and I'm also giving it points for the nearby Ferris wheel and swing ride. Belleville Mountains are A tier. The Niagara Jump. Les Sauts du Niagara, or the Niagara Jump, is horrifying, and not what it seems. The first thing that got me deep diving into this specific coaster was Haynes' note that it was possibly the world's first water ride. In the play The Battle of the Mountains, the person representing the Niagara Jump is constantly describing it with metaphors related to water and diving in and taking the plunge. However, the more I looked into it, as far as I can tell, the water was just a metaphor. The rides are shaped like gondolas, there's a Niagara Falls decoration, but as far as I can tell, there was not a pool of water for people to splash through at the bottom. Although it could have been possible, there are similar, very early rides with similar structures. Then we get to our second point of confusion. Why is it called the Niagara Jump? Why is the first line in the description a warning about how frightening the ride is? Why does it contain an unreassuring reassurance that, quote, the police would never allow an amusement like this if it would compromise the lives of the citizens? Why does the play The Battle of the Mountains have a footnote describing the Niagara Jump as dangerous, as if it's dangerous on another level to the other roller coasters? Then I zoomed into the illustration and, oh no! Like in Roller Coaster Tycoon, where you don't finish your track so people will just fly off? Is that the jump? Actually, no. I dug into this in a frenzy, and it turns out the truth is even more bizarre and possibly even more dangerous. If you see the jump of Niagara from another angle, for example, this illustration from an 1818 songbook containing a bunch of songs about the roller coaster, you can see that the track has two parts. The bottom half was fixed and immovable. The top half was on a hinge and could move from a flat horizontal position to a steep 45-degree angle. The first illustration that I showed you earlier actually depicts this too. You can see on the right side the track is in the flat position. On the left side, it's beginning to go into that raised 45-degree angle position. Here's a rough animation. My guess is that if the top half were fully raised, if the hinge was straight, it would connect perfectly with the bottom half of the track. So based on the description in this image, as well as the photographs, here's how I think this ride experience went. You climbed up a flight of stairs, and then, as the top half of the track was in that flat, horizontal position, you loaded yourself into the cart. The flat position made it easy to ensure the cart could fit snugly into the rails, and also to ensure that people could easily step inside. Then, according to the description underneath this illustration, the cart would be kept in place by a hook, as that top half of the track would be slowly lifted up to a, quote, 45-degree angle. At this point, you would be 60 feet in the air. The description beneath this image describes the feeling like this. While he is ascending, this new Argonaut has time to contemplate the abyss into which he will rush, and he shudders to think that the slightest accident, if it were possible, could cause a shipwreck that no human power would remedy. He trembles. Yeah, you should tremble. So after that, the track is in place, hopefully connecting perfectly with the second half of the track. Once it's perfectly connected, the hook is released and the cart slides down. According to the description, a person would travel 250 feet in 6 seconds. Obviously, that's what the ride looks like when everything goes perfectly and the track pieces connect how they should, but it often did not. In that songbook I mentioned earlier, multiple songs from 1818 describe the experience of riding the Jump of Niagara. One of them, roughly translated, says, "I was told this alluring attraction was always free of accidents. However, I've noticed that many people trip at the end." In French, this rhymes, and is probably a bop. But the funniest thing to me is that even in this souvenir illustration thing, the description makes suggestions for how the owners could theoretically improve the safety features on the ride. If I understand the writer, he suggests adding some kind of safety barrier at the end of the top half of the ramp that will only go down once the ramp is in the proper position. Which is just really wild to me. Imagine if, Space Mountain didn't have lap bars, so people kept falling off and getting badly hurt. And then you could go to the gift shop and buy a t-shirt saying, "We probably should have put a lap bar on this roller coaster. Maybe that's something we should do in the future." Iconic, legendary power move. We're going to put the Niagara Jump in the A tier for the sheer boldness of its vision. The Egyptian Mountains. Putting aside the Orientalism of the name for a moment, the thing that fascinates me the most about this ride is the lift system. The carts would be placed here on this elevator-like platform, which would then be slowly raised by the means of a pulley system. That's very exciting, so I'm going to put it in A tier. Next up, the Swiss Mountains. The most fascinating image I've found of the Swiss mountains is this illustration. First, I want to address these lamps. Early 19th century France was primarily lit by oil lamps. However, by the mid to late 19th century, Paris's lighting was slowly replaced by the more modern gas lanterns. It appears that this illustration might possibly depict gas lanterns, which were actually very associated with the Russian mountains. In the play The Battle of the Mountains, for example, there's a running gag about a self-proclaimed lamp artist who wants to replace Paris's oil lamps with modern gas ones, and who repeatedly offers his services to the Russian mountains. And while I know you guys are all craving more deep lamp lore, let's go back to the roller coasters. Another fascinating thing about the Swiss mountains is these ride carts. One of them is shaped like a horse. How intriguing, how exciting, how whimsical. Just for the horse, let's put it in A tier. The Russian Mountains. The Russian mountains at the Barrière du Roule were one of the earliest roller coasters in Paris. There were two basic ice slide style roller coasters sitting right next to each other. They were very similar to the mountains of Belleville, so I won't repeat anything I've said there. I will say that there were lots of illustrations of these specific roller coasters. One big struggle I had in researching this is that all the roller coasters were often called by multiple names and nicknames, so it takes time to sort out the images and figure out which illustrations are all depicting the same ride and which illustrations are depicting different rides. I may be one of the very first people to do the digging it takes to sort these images in a way that distinguishes the Barrière du Roule Russian mountains from the other ones. So I'm just going to let these beautiful, powerful images speak for themselves. A tier. So there were a lot of coasters that I couldn't mention for time, but look at that. Look at our tier list. Not a single bad track. All A tier, perfect rides that you should definitely ride if you ever happen to be in 1817 France. But now that we have an overview of the breadth of designs and different ideas behind the Russian mountains, we're finally ready to talk about some overarching themes of how they felt and how they were viewed. Part 3D, the modernity of it all. The first thing I find so compelling about the Russian mountains is how weirdly modern they feel. It's hard to read descriptions of the pleasure gardens and not be reminded of modern-day amusement parks. You have the large roller coaster that's supposed to be the big draw, then the smaller rides, and the carnival games, and the little food stands. One of these illustrations mentions ice cream as a necessary part of your Russian mountains experience, which reminds me of how modern Six Flags really like to advertise their overpriced Dole Whip. The descriptions of riding the roller coasters are also weirdly modern, waiting in queues, getting to the top and losing your nerve, or giggling in anticipation. I really love this illustration of people riding the coasters at Beaujon, especially this man with his young daughter sitting on his lap. It reminds me of the roller coasters at kiddie theme parks that are designed so that parents can ride them with their young children. Side note, this could have been Fantine, Tholomyès, and Cosette. But alas. Another side note, I love this woman. She's got her fashion, she's got that monocle thing, she's like the roller coaster buff of her era. She was born too soon to have a theme park vlog. Tragic. Basically, all of this really drives home how we have more in common with the people of the past than we might actually think. How many modern inventions have actually been around in different form for a very, very long time. But there's one significant aspect of the Russian mountains that I haven't talked about yet, but that you might have picked up if you've been paying close attention to the illustrations. And that's the weird horniness. Part 3E. Let's talk about love. Another way in which the Russian mountains were similar to modern amusement park rides is that they were viewed as a romantic spot, a place where young lovers could go on dates. They're often talked about in ways that remind me of rides like a Tunnel of Love today. A thrilling ride down a Russian mountain was seen as flirtatious because it gave young women an excuse to cling to their boyfriends as their skirts flew in the wind. Many illustrations portray riding the mountains as a very romantic or bawdy activity. This illustration is called The Indiscreet Wind, or The Charms of the Russian Mountains. It depicts a pretty woman's skirt flying up in the wind as she clutches the hand of a very round old man, whose parasol is placed in a perhaps very symbolic position. A guy behind her tries to look up her skirt, but thankfully, this extremely buff lady is here to help. Another similar illustration, which appears to be part of the same series, was called English Curiosity, or The Dangers of the Russian Mountains. It depicts a man flopping out of his cart and falling underneath a woman's skirt. Womp womp. Many plays featuring the Russian mountains also featured romance as a major component. According to Haynes, quote, "A common trope is the sexual threat posed by the rides, especially for young single women." But it wasn't all looking at women's skirts. In this illustration, you see a woman sliding down the Russian mountains with one man on either arm. Beneath it is the lyrics to one of the period's songs about the Russian mountains. Now, my French isn't good enough to do a decent translation, but you can find the full thing in a songbook listed in my list of sources. The main chorus talks about how fun it is to roll down the coasters, and one of the verses talks about a married woman who does something indiscreet with another man in the carts. Throughout all these illustrations I've been showing you, couples are almost always heavily featured. The descriptions beneath the illustrations also nearly always continue on that theme, playfully describing romantic date ideas. This one describes how you and your beautiful woman can have a lovely romantic day in the pleasure gardens, and the description of the Saut du Niagara includes a joke about how the ladies' husbands may be upset about the color of the roller coaster's flags. And as I've mentioned before, the injuries and accidents were also framed romantically. Roller coaster crashes were opportunities for indecent or chivalrous behavior. The Niagara Jumps description insists that women shouldn't worry about falling off the coaster because a chivalrous man will probably be there to help them to their feet, which I imagine is a huge consolation for someone with a horribly broken leg or something. And do you remember those magnificent verses I read you earlier from the 1818 novel The Fudge Family in Paris, the one from the perspective of a young woman named Biddy visiting Paris for the first time? There's something I didn't tell you. And that's the fact that Biddy Fudge's entire plotline is about getting seduced by a stranger on the Russian mountains. Basically, Biddy Fudge is trying to have a normal ride on the roller coaster when she's approached by a kind of crusty-looking old man. He offers to ride with her on the roller coaster, and she accepts. After the two of them ride the roller coaster all night, she suddenly becomes enamored with him and with his bravery. Quote, Oh, as I gazed on the features and air of the man who for me all this peril defied, I could fancy almost he and I were a pair of unhappy young lovers who thus, side by side, were taking, instead of rope, pistols, or dagger, a desperate dash down the falls of Niagara. Rhyming Daggera with Niagara is a choice. But in case you missed it, she's saying that riding the Russian mountains made me feel like we were two young lovers who were trying to kill ourselves, but instead of using guns, we were jumping over the Niagara Falls. So it must be true love. Throughout the rest of the book, Biddy Fudge keeps ignoring all of this man's red flags and obvious lies because the night on the roller coaster was just so wonderful she can't think of anything else. They, quote, sailed through the air together. How could she believe he was anything less than a hero? You can obviously see how this is relevant to Les Mis and Fantine. However, just as Fantine's story wasn't just about love, the Russian Mountain story is not just about love either. We need to talk about class struggle. Many descriptions of the Russian mountains portray them as a place where people of different classes intermingled. Peggy Davis unearthed old contemporary newspaper articles opining on how the mountains reflected France's obsession with class inequality. She writes, quote, "A chronicler of the Gazette de France opined that over the past few years, Parisians have only sought to elevate themselves, but today they only aspire to fall. A prevailing taste for the mountains has spread even to the lowest rungs of society. Craftsmen's and grisettes' hopes plummet all week long, yet they compensate them with reality on Sundays. I've noticed characters that, after embarking on the ride hardly looking at each other and affecting airs of superiority, reach the bottom conversing with near familiarity. How true it is that we become more human as we descend." Davis continues with another translation of a quote from the Journal of Paris, where the author writes, quote, "We see financiers and shopwomen, seigneurs and grisettes plummet together. Notice that this furor for making mountains everywhere appears at a time when all we talk about is equality and social leveling. What reconciles everyone is that, far from erecting mountains to dominate, we climb them only to fall." I don't think this is what Victor Hugo intended by including the Russian mountains in Les Mis, but I do think their brief appearance in the novel reflects Hugo's memory of them as a place where different classes intermingled. The wealthy, high-class students, like Tholomyès, take their lower-class grisette lovers on a roller coaster. This was a place where different classes tend to mix together. However, speaking of falling, we need to talk about the fall of the Russian mountains. 3G, the fall. So why did the Russian mountains go away if they were so insanely popular? Let's talk about the most obvious problem that you've probably already guessed at. The description of the Niagara jump reassures nervous ladies that, quote, "the police would never allow such an amusement if it could compromise the lives of the citizens." The Russian mountains killed multiple people and injured many more. In his book Travels to Russia, Gautier blames the failure of the mountains on the constant maimings of their riders. He writes, quote, "Accidents were frequent, for at times the cars ran off the track. This was why the dangerous amusement was given up. There were even lawsuits against the Garden Beaujon for the injuries and deaths on the French mountains. And so many articles, illustrations, songs, vaudevilles, etc. refer to the rides as perilous and make jokes about people falling off and getting injured. The play The Battle of the Mountains features a character whose entire family was injured on the Russian mountains, and yet he still supports them. However, it's possible the rides may have still stuck around despite all these issues and all the injuries they caused if it weren't for a series of other major factors affecting their growth. There was the end of the occupation, change in tourist habits, and good old French political instability. But one really major factor was the way that Paris was slowly devouring its suburbs and turning them into extensions of the city, which also took away a lot of the land formerly used by the pleasure gardens. According to Sun Yun Park, quote, "The popularity of the pleasure gardens and the diverse crowds that they had summoned disclosed the real estate potential of this urban periphery. During the financial speculation and construction fervor of the 1820s, many of these properties were completely reparceled and developed as urban neighborhoods. The very failure of privately run leisure gardens thus played an important role in the development of Parisian urbanism. The eventual disintegration of their enclosures paved the way for Paris's subsequent modernization." To quote Christina Haynes, in a similar vein, "In the early 1820s, Beaujon, like Tivoli, was devoured in a building spree in western Paris, before a bust in 1826 left the area a semi-urban wasteland that became home to gangs of bandits. So all these pleasure gardens we've been discussing, with their lovely rides and amusements, would be casualties of Paris's changing cityscape. They would be lost to time, like much of the old city during the 19th century." To quote Volume 1 of Les Mis, describing the pleasure gardens that Fantine visits, quote, "It is hard nowadays to picture to oneself what a pleasure trip of students and grisettes to the country was like 45 years ago. The suburbs of Paris are no longer the same. Where there was the cuckoo, there is the railway car. Where there was the tender boat, there is now the steamboat. People speak of Fécamp nowadays as they spoke of St. Cloud in those days. The Paris of 1862 is a city which has France for its outskirts. The pleasure gardens are now gone, the Russian mountains are now gone, and unlike the ice slides of Russia or the switchback railways of the United States, they're not even really remembered all too much in popular culture. And that brings us to our next question, which is, what was their legacy, and how should we remember them? And in order to answer these questions, we'll need to talk about how and why they appear in Victor Hugo's smash hit 1862 novel, Les Miserables. Part 4, Les Mis, Russian Mountains, and the Politics of Nostalgia. First, let's begin with a quick refresher on the plot. As I mentioned before, the roller coaster shows up in the section of the novel where the young working-class Fantine is going on a date with her rich, middle-aged lover. It's a quadruple date with 3 other couples. This section begins with a chapter describing the historical context of the year 1817. Then we get multiple chapters describing how, quote, the 4 couples conscientiously went through all the country follies possible at the time, with highly detailed descriptions of all the different quirky amusements that existed in 1817 Paris. The couples finish off their adventures by riding the Russian mountains together. Then, at the end of the day, the woman's lovers abandon them, never to return. Let's combine that with the context we just learned. Fantine rode the Russian mountains in the Garden Beaujon. This was the largest and most impressive of all the roller coasters in France at the time. Roller coasters had a strong connotation of being a place of romance and flirtation at the period. They also had the connotations of being places where different classes intermingled and were able to socialize together. Multiple sources refer to it as a place where rich men could mingle with grisettes. This is why it makes a lot of sense that Tholomyès would take Fantine here on a date. The mountains also reflect the atmosphere of Paris in the early days of the Restoration, the search for frivolous amusements to cover up deeper underlying tensions. With all of that out of the way, we transition into discussing the major reason why I believe the Russian mountains are in the novel, to reflect the fads of the year 1817. Fantine's story takes up Book 3 of Volume 1 of Les Mis, but rather than starting with the story of Fantine, Book 3 begins by giving us the historical context about the era she lives in. This is referenced in Cham's 1863 comic parody of Les Mis, which depicts a reader desperately hopping over a bunch of French historical figures in order to finally get to Fantine's plotline. But rather than hop over it, we're actually going to focus on that historical context for a moment. Book 3 is titled In the Year 1817. The first chapter is titled The Year 1817. This chapter begins with the line, 1817 was the year. For the rest of this opening chapter, Victor Hugo then goes on to list a ton of things that were iconic parts of this era. He discusses the defeat of Napoleon, the restoration of Louis XVIII, and then he describes famous fashion trends, political figures, popular plays, famous actresses, planned assassination attempts, famous tightrope walkers, the occupation of France by foreign armies, all these important historical events and frivolous fads thrown together in one big slurry. Podcaster David Montgomery describes it as, quote, the 19th century equivalent of We Didn't Start the Fire. It's important to acknowledge that Les Mis was published in 1862, only about 40 years after the year 1817, when it was 1817, that year. Hugo's audience would have recognized and had a lot of feelings about a lot of the things he mentions. In 1863, for example, a conservative named Félix Cortat wrote a scathing review of Les Mis, where he described the year 1817 chapter like this, quote, many readers interpreted this as a satire against the Restoration. Was the author justified in writing this? For reference, if someone today was writing about the fads of 40 years ago, they would be writing about the fads of, get ready for some psychic damage, the 1980s. I personally like to compare these 1817 chapters with a running gag in the Netflix animated show BoJack Horseman. Whenever a character in BoJack Horseman has a flashback to a previous decade, we get a scene where the character drives down the street past a series of over-the-top visual jokes referencing things that were popular at the time. For example, in BoJack's flashback to the 1980s, he drives past advertisements for leg warmers, Rubik's Cubes, Walkmans, Tag Soda, and fanny packs, as well as signs advertising Ronald Reagan's trickle-down savings and Gorbachev's explosive deals. This all happens while he's singing a generic 1980s song where all the lyrics are about how it's the 1980s.
This is a song from the 80s, the decade which it currently is.
This is a song from the 80s, the decade which it currently is, reminds me so much of the way that Fantine's plotline starts with the Book 3 in the year 1817, Chapter 1 the year 1817, 1817 was the year. It feels like it's basically the same joke. Sadly, many abridged versions of the novel just cut the 1817 history chapter entirely, beginning with Fantine and Tholomyès' date without any of that historical context included. To me, that feels like if, 150 years from now, people were still watching BoJack Horseman, but when they got to the flashback running gags, they got super confused and didn't understand why they were there, because the references were so old they were out of cultural memory.
Generic
2007 pop song. Auto-tune so all the voices sound weird.
This is a pop song. It's 2007.
And you can see how that relates to the Russian mountains, right? As we discussed earlier, the Russian mountains were a fad. They did not have longevity. They were a short-lived, silly fad inextricably tied to the early days of Louis XVIII's reign, the defeat of Napoleon, and France's occupation by foreign armies. They could have only existed in the form that they did within this very specific context. They are something that was absolutely of their era. So while the mountains aren't given tons of focus in this chapter, they are important. They're kind of like the Rubik's Cube salesman in the 80s episode of BoJack Horseman. They're just one of the many ways in which Victor Hugo is grounding the audience in the feeling of this time period by referencing specific fads and silly short-lived phenomena they might remember. Victor Hugo writes about Fantine riding the Russian mountains for the same reasons he describes the fads for Moroccan leather caps and English hairstyles. It's to ground you within the very specific world of the time period. I was going to joke that we should rewrite these chapters in the style of the BoJack Horseman flashback gags, but then I realized that's kind of just how they're written. Like, there's literally a scene where Fantine passes by children singing a generic song about the restoration of the king, which is like, it's literally just generic restoration pop song about the restoration that we're currently in. But both the year 1817 and BoJack Horseman are making these fun nostalgic jokes for a reason. All these little details ground the story in a very specific era and historical context with very specific politics. The 90s episode of BoJack Horseman grounds you in the 1990s because one of the major plot points revolves around a gay man persecuted by the specific 1990s brand of homophobia. Similarly, the 1817 chapter of Les Mis grounds you in 1817 because it's aiming to capture the very specific political mood of Paris after the restoration of the monarchy. And while the tone of these chapters is very satirical, at the same time it's also very nostalgic. And now we move on to our final, most important point. In 1851, Victor Hugo was exiled from France for his radical politics, particularly his criticism of Emperor Napoleon III. He wrote the majority of Les Mis while in exile from Guernsey, England, where he also continued to criticize the French government and aid in resistance efforts. It is difficult to emphasize how much Victor Hugo's exile is crucial to understanding the novel, and to understanding the public perception of Victor Hugo at the time. Anyone who read Les Mis in the 19th century was aware of Hugo's exile and reading the book with his exile at the forefront of their minds. Les Mis is in part a call to action against Napoleon III's regime, but Victor Hugo obviously also wanted it to be able to be published in France, which meant he had to do a complicated tap dance around France's censorship laws. As a result, he often criticizes his exile by implication, rather than criticizing it directly. So Hugo's descriptions of the loveliness of Paris in Les Mis are not just pretty, they are also overtly political. Victor Hugo essentially spends tons of pages going, "Oh, it's so lovely to be in Paris. Wouldn't it be so evil if the French government forced someone to leave the country? Wouldn't that be such a horrible thing to do to a person? Of course, I'm being very brave about it, like a noble martyr for my righteous cause." Another important aspect of this is that, during the time of Victor Hugo's exile, Paris was undergoing a series of massive, major renovations. The city Hugo knew so well was being replaced by a city he no longer recognized. Many of the things Victor Hugo discusses in the chapters about 1817 are things that no longer existed by the time of his exile. As we mentioned before, many of the pleasure gardens he describes in such lavish detail were destroyed, reduced, and built over during the suburb's slow urbanization. Similarly, the fashions he describes in these chapters were no longer fashionable, the cheap amusements were no longer in vogue, and even the roller coasters that the characters ride were a brief fad that had been gone for decades and decades. The chapter where Victor Hugo discusses his exile most explicitly is Volume 2, Book 5, Chapter 1. I'm going to quote almost all of the section because I think it's very significant for understanding Victor Hugo's intent when he gives us these long, loving descriptions of parts of Paris that no longer exist and pieces of Paris that have been lost to time irrevocably. Quote, "The author of this book, who regrets the necessity of mentioning himself, has been absent from Paris for many years. Paris has been transformed since he quitted it. A new city has arisen, which is, after a fashion, unknown to him. In consequence of demolitions and reconstructions, the Paris of his youth, the Paris which he bore away religiously in his memory, is now a Paris of days gone by. For his own part, he is unacquainted with a new Paris, and he writes with the old Paris before his eyes, in an illusion which is precious to him. It is a delight to him to dream that there still lingers behind him something of that which he beheld when he was in his own country, and that all has not vanished. So long as you come and go in your native land, you imagine that those streets are a matter of indifference to you, that those windows, those roofs, and those doors are nothing to you, that those walls are strangers to you, that those trees are merely the first encountered haphazard, that those houses which you do not enter are useless to you, and that those pavements which you tread are merely stones. Later on, when you are no longer there, you perceive that those streets were dear to you, that you missed those roofs, those doors, that those walls are necessary to you, that those trees are well beloved by you, that you entered those houses which you never entered every day, and that you have left a part of your heart, of your blood, of your soul in those pavements. I think a lot about Victor Hugo's descriptions of the Paris that he lost. Buildings, trees, and structures that were all very unimportant, things that he thought were frivolous, became suddenly significant after they were gone. These things that seemed so trivial at the time, minor, trivial, everyday aspects of life that he barely thought about, suddenly became these objects of grief and lost history. It's hard not to compare that to his descriptions of the Parisian suburbs of 1817 and all their small eccentricities, like the Russian mountains, that would slowly be lost to time. To quote the chapter of Les Mis that precedes Fantine's date and her ride on the roller coaster, quote, "This is what floats up confusedly, pell-mell, for the year 1817, and is now forgotten. History neglects nearly all these particulars, and cannot do otherwise. The infinity would overwhelm it. Nevertheless, these details, which are wrongly called trivial, there are no trivial facts in humanity, nor little leaves in vegetation, are useful. It is of the figure of the years that the face of the centuries is composed." Thank you for watching, and thank you for making it all the way to the end. This presentation was originally made for an event called BarricadeesCon, which is an online Les Mis convention full of panels just like this. If you're interested in learning more about BarricadeesCon, and you should be, check out the link in my description. In the description, I will also include my list of sources, all the sources that I cited in this video, as well as a link to an old song I found from the Battle of the Mountains play that I kept talking about that I really wanted to have someone do a cover for this video, but I just never got the chance to do it. So all of that stuff is in the description. I definitely recommend checking out BarricadeesCon because it's a great event. All the profits go to charity. It's really excellent. So thank you again for making it to the end of this very long video, and I hope you have a wonderful day.